This is Killer Innovations, a show about ideas, creativity, and how you can innovate. Welcome to the Innovator's Garage, where you learn to create your next game-changing killer innovation.
Welcome to Killer Innovations. I'm your host, Phil McKinney. We are here back in the studio in Colorado. Been on the road for a little bit. We've been out meeting with interesting innovators through the Midwest. So stay tuned. We've got some of those shows coming up as we've continued our road tour, talking to small businesses, medium, and even large enterprises who are doing interesting work that's not tied to the traditional coast or Silicon Valley, which is kind of an interesting twist for me, given my background as having been the CTO at HP, that I am a firm believer that there's innovation occurring all over the four corners of the country, and sometimes we just need to give them a little TLC and recognize some of that the great work that's doing. Today we have a special guest. Some of you have heard me talk about my frequent trips recently to Washington, D.C., and some of the work we've been doing, particularly with the U.S. Marine Corps on innovation, et cetera. And today we have a very special guest. We've been very excited about having today's conversation. Today's guest is Secretary Geurts. He is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition. He is a retired Air Force colonel who then also came back in and worked as a civilian. He has been involved in a whole wide range of activities, including procurement for Special Operations Command, and has received, and in fact, the list here of recognitions that Secretary Geurts has received would probably take the first two segments if I listed all of them. Secretary Geurts, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us here today on the show.
Hey, awesome, Phil. Glad to be here and glad to talk with you.
So one of the things, given, some of the work that I've been doing at Quantica with the U.S. Marine Corps, which also falls, albeit it says Navy, and I always have to remind people it's Navy and Marine Corps because you have responsibility also for the Marine Corps portion of that. And I've gotten to, I don't come from a government background. I was not in the military. My father was, my uncle was, all my brother-in-laws are ex-military. But having spent some time in the Marine Corps, I've gotten a little bit of an education on how hard the challenge is given the size of an organization and the acquisition. Now, when we say acquisition, and it falls under your purview, you have a much broader definition of acquisition. It's not just the purchasing process, which a lot of people in the business world would assume to. So what are you focused on when it comes to, quote, acquisition activities in a large organization like the Navy?
Yeah, it is. The scale sometimes can be a little bit daunting, and you got to make sure you don't let the scale kind of cloud your approach. Just a sense of scale. Last year, we did about $117 billion in contracts, about 240,000 contracts. And that's responsibility here in my office, everything from early basic research through applied research to kind of classic development, to procurement, to fielding, and then all the sustainment of all the assets. So that's, 300 ship Navy. It's all the Marine Corps equipment. It's a pretty daunting kind of scope, not from a sense of how to treat that and not do the classic bureaucratic make everything the same. And so I would say that the two or three core ways to approach, if I would say my mindset is how do we create a multi-dexterous organization? I think all very large organizations have a hard time doing more than one thing or more than a thing many different ways, because bureaucracies like to standardize processes, standardize training, standardize hiring, and they overvalue standardization for efficiency, and all that standardization comes with compromises and sub-optimization. And so the real challenge for me at the highest levels is how do we get this organization to do lots of things well? And I have to, perfect. We could have hopefully we'll talk some about innovation in public service because it's got some unique opportunities and challenges. But there are areas where we cannot fail. We cannot fail to defend the country. We can't fail to protect sailors and Marines under our command. We can't fail to deliver national security. Yet we want to do that aggressively and boldly and harness and not be afraid to try. And so the great leadership opportunity for me is supporting a team that's got to do all of that simultaneously at scale and at speed.
Well, it does require, though, that you have to be almost a little schizophrenic, right? Because, as you said, national security, safety in the home front, make sure that the people we put in harm's way are protected and safe. I've heard you in previous talks describe kind of the different focuses, even on innovation, around what you called the wet procurement and the dry procurement. Wet procurement meaning, you're the guy that buys the battleships, you're the guy that buys the submarines, but you also have the responsibility for the items used on the ground, boots on the ground, doing the work.
Yeah, so I think classically we view those two things as being in contention, and I actually have the flip side. I think you have great opportunity because you have to do both operate at scale and at speed. And kind of my wet-dry analogy is the nuclear submarine, which we want to build. When we build the hull, we want it to last 30, 40, 50 years. And we want to do that very efficiently because they're expensive. And we're protecting a lot of humans. And so thinking very deliberately and thoughtfully about how to do that large scale, millions of man-hour design and construction. But the acoustic algorithm I have inside, I want to update that at the speed of relevance. And so we've actually come up with ways to differentiate that work. And that's a really, really important term when you get into large scale innovation is differentiation. And being able to differentiate the work we want to do, high cycle, high iteration speed, low iteration cost, say acoustic algorithms, and think about that differently than we think about the thing where we want low iteration speed but assured performance, like building a safe and a long-lasting structure. And so that culture, building that where both sides are valued, it's not just the cool kids that are doing the quick innovation algorithms for a day. There is valued, or it's not just the senior engineer that's got the weight of a nuclear power plant and protecting all those people. Both sides need to be valued. And what I found is once you focus on mission, and so the primary focus I always go back to is mission. And if you can ground on mission, not how you're doing the work, but how does that work contribute to the mission, then all of those, nasty little human elements that get in the way of this innovation stuff start to move away. And we do have, so our challenge in the military is a daunting job at daunting scale. But I'm kind of an abundance thinker, and we have an abundance of mission. We have an abundance of talent. We have an abundance of need. And quite frankly, if we're smart enough, we can have an abundance of suppliers to help us out. Everybody, I think, if I go walk around the country, whether you're a small business or a big business, you want to help the military. Mm-hmm. The challenge is how to make it easy to do so and not more painful than anything else.
Exactly. But you bring up a good point where a lot of large organizations, the government being, the poster child, though, gets locked into one approach, right? And the fact that even within a nuclear submarine, you've got multiple threads of innovation pacing that's occurring inside a single deliverable versus most organizations say, well, I'm going to deliver X, and therefore I'm going to run one innovation cycle process to deliver X. I think that's pretty unique.
So you can't take that approach. So what you've got to do is synchronize multiple lines of operation, right, at the speed of relevance for each one of those lines, but then have them so they're not contending. And we often also forget about I can get an acquisition system working really quickly. I did a pretty good job at the SOCOM. I think we're doing a pretty good job in the Navy. but you can't outpace the absorption rate for your users to be able to absorb the technology. So it's even bigger than just the technology cycle and the acquisition cycle. It's how do I absorb that into training and build tactics? Because the real capabilities, equipment, tactics, and training, you got to think of all three.
And that's a great topic because it's one that we've had on the show before about you can innovate at such a rapid pace that nobody can integrate it because you don't have a meshing mechanism of the output of innovation to the ability for the organization to absorb that or take advantage of it. And you actually tend to overinvest then because you overinvest and now it's sitting idle. We're going to take a quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Secretary Geurts. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to Killer Innovations. Welcome back to Killer Innovations. We are continuing our conversation with Secretary Geurts, who is the Assistant Secretary of the Navy for Research, Development, and Acquisition. Now, Secretary Geurts, I noticed, we talked in the last segment, about your size and scale. You're managing more than $100 billion of spend on behalf of the Navy and the Marine Corps. And we talked in the last segment, though, that you're trying to manage that procurement process in a cycle of where the Navy and the Marines are dependent on you to deliver the right thing at the right time. And how do you mesh all of that? That's ultimately, game theory, salesmanship, mathematical problem that no one's ever been able to solve.
Yeah, I think I think two core ways to attack that. Maybe two or three ways that I've attacked it. One, you've got to ruthlessly decentralize. So if you think you can manage that all at the top by making every decision and having the force of personality and the bandwidth to manage every one of those unique decisions, you'll burn a lot of staff time and you'll never get there. So I'm a huge fan of intent, right, and empowerment. And so if you can empower your workforce, they understand where you're trying to go, but they are free to make the decisions to get there. That if you're not going to do that, I don't know how you do it. No matter how good your business analytics and business intelligence, business intelligence never makes up for commander's intent in my estimation. The second piece is you got to give them lots of different tools. And this is where I think a lot of large organizations fail because they kind of have a sawzall approach, right? You want to have one tool that can do everything, so it does everything equally poorly, as opposed to have lots of different tools and differentiate the work so that you can kind of free up that the ability of an empowered workforce to pick the right tool. And then finally, I think you've got to if you can get your iteration speed up, you can get your your ability to absorb change, whether that's because you learned something because it didn't go right, or the threat changed, or your business environment changed, or your funding changed. You've got to have an agility mindset where it's not create a perfect plan, execute a perfect plan that takes 10 years. It's create a good enough plan with proper intent and let folks use the tools they do, and then measure, but kind of have this agility or pivot speed. Getting pivot speed at an organization of 130,000 government and military acquisition people in the Department of Navy is a challenge, but it's actually easier than I think folks. We don't do things because we think it's too tough, and we underperform because we don't drive high enough expectations of what the output can be when you really empower people.
Well, I'm going to come back to the agility piece, but you hit on an important point with regards to, the workforce and the leader's intent. So how do you communicate your intent as the assistant secretary through that entire organization? Because as you said, you can't be in every meeting. You can't review every bid. You can't engage with every supplier.
So I think, again, we make it we try and overthink it. So, one of the things I want to do is I want to learn fast. And the way we're going to learn fast is acting fast and not being afraid if everything doesn't go perfectly. So one of the things I do for all my direct reports, their first performance reportable item to me is they have to be working on something with a 50% chance or higher of failure. Now, that's the first thing I measure them on. Now, I measure judgment. So like, don't pick the law or don't pick ethics, or maybe don't pick something that's going to kill somebody as the thing you want to do. But I found if I say, hey, we want to press the bounds of the possible, but I'm only going to measure you on what succeeds, we will undershoot the target. And it's amazing when I measure somebody on taking risk. And because where I'm trying to teach the staff is I don't want to just take risk for risk-taking's sake. I want to make sure we're taking the appropriate risk for the job. And so if we're too risk-averse on the easy things, that will waste resources that won't allow me to apply them to the things where I really need to focus and I can't afford to take risk, like safety.
Right.
And so it's not that we want to take risk just for risk-taking sense. It's how do we get the risk right for the job and then challenge ourselves to be different. The second thing is challenging diversity and inclusion. You can't win at scale without diversity and inclusion, not just being like a principle or a feels good kind of thing. It has to be a core competitive value. And that's a real challenge, particularly if you've got a technical organization like the Department of Navy, who prides itself on its technical know-how. Rewarding folks for getting the answer, even if it didn't come from them organically, is a cultural thing we've got to take on. But once you start rewarding that, and then the third piece I would say is, as I get rid of stupid in the organization, things that are wasting time, I tell folks, don't replace it with more stupid, right? Trade that low value kind of calorie burn for things that are really important, like talking to each other, like sharing best practices, like better networking. And that's the way we're so empowering folks, right? And using intent every day. Every time you take a briefing, every time you make a decision, explain the intent. Right? Explain, I had an old boss that says, as a leader, communicate 10 times more often in 10 different ways than you think you need to, and you'll reach 10% of your audience.
It is so true. As having been a CTO or at HP, I had 40,000 engineers in the reporting, they were in the engineering side at HP. And you had to repeat it so many times. You were like, how many more times do I have to repeat myself in saying this thing? But you're right. You got to say it 10 times and you might get 10% of the audience.
Yeah, and then if you're a leader, you've got to really place yourself. We all talk about servant leadership, but if you see any org chart of mine, I'm at the bottom of every org chart. And I firmly believe, my job is to create the conditions and the foundation for my direct reports. Their job is to create the foundation and guidance and intent for their teams. Their teams is to deliver services and products to Marines and sailors. And it's amazing just by having your org chart where you're at the bottom, how much that every day reinforces the fact they're not there for you, you're there for them.
Well, and I think it's, in your case, I think not only is it on the org chart, but, you exemplify it. I've watched a number of your other interviews. I've talked to people who are on your staff or other parts, and the respect they have for you and the fact that your servant leadership translates to them is quite evident. So kudos for that. We're going to take another quick commercial break. When we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Secretary Geurts. When we come back, we're going to pick up the topic on agility and how that applies into the work at the Navy. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. You're listening to Killer Innovations. Welcome back. We're continuing our conversation with Secretary Geurts. Now, we wrapped up in the last segment talking about, the org chart and my impressions having interacted with your team in that, you're one of those officials that doesn't stand on airs, which impresses me to no end. And in fact, many people refer to you as Hondo. Now, I've also seen where people try to figure out where the Hondo name came from, but that's got to be a beer conversation. So the next time I come out to do work at the Marine Corps, maybe we can connect up and I can finally hear the story about how Hondo came about as your nickname. But that's actually pretty common. A lot of people refer to you as Hondo.
They do, and I'd be happy is with enough beer, you might learn something.
Well, let's go back to the part of the conversation in the last segment. We were talking about agility and the importance of agility. You were talking about, the fact that, you're trying to set out a plan so that you can adapt to whether it's change in funding, change in mission, something new comes in, change in direction, some form of criticality that might trigger a change. So how do you plan for an unknown? Because you don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah, I think, and I've, said many times, I'm much more of a fan of agility as a concept than innovation, because I think innovation sometimes it's hard. I can measure agility. I can measure pivot speed. I have a harder time measuring the kind of innovation because it can, it's one of those terms that can mean a lot of things to a lot of people. So when I think, agility, it is about pivot speed. It's how do we not only manage downside risk, but even more importantly, take advantage of upside opportunity. And that can be terribly complex in a public service kind of centrally planned bureaucracy if you're not careful. But I also, my dozen or so years of special ops taught me the value of planning for the unplanned and building a culture and a mindset and a set of skills that increase your pivot speed. Some of that is, kind of breaking down this fear of trying something new. Some of that is having a learning environment where you value the best idea, not necessarily everybody's individual idea. Most part of it comes from having a great network with radical levels of diversity and inclusion. Whether that's big businesses, small businesses, two people in the garage businesses, academic performers, foreign partner things, because generally you get pivot speed from, my best form of R&D is rip off and deploy, right? Taking an idea that somebody else has and adapting it for your use. You've got to have the culture that values that rather than just, only valuing inventing it yourself. And if you can start getting that level of kind of multi-dexterous organizations that can do the things they have to do organically well, transition other things, that's important. And then finally, being very thoughtful of your business architecture and your technical architecture, and in the case of warfighting, your operational architecture, so that you reduce the impedance mismatch for new things being able to link in and integrate. We tend to, kind of in this last decade of innovation everything, we overvalue discovery and we undervalue deployment. And so we can discover lots of stuff, but if you can't get it in the hands of your ultimate end user, it's an interesting discovery, but not really effective on the battlefield. And so that's the way we kind of start thinking about that problem.
Well, it's interesting because I think some of the regular listeners of the show are going to think I fed you that line, because one of the things we talk a lot about the show is ideas without execution is a hobby, and we're not in the hobby business. Right. It's ideas made real.
Particularly national security.
Exactly. Something on a notebook or a PowerPoint slide is of zero value. If it can't be used and deployed, that's where value gets created.
Yeah, the other thing I've learned a lot, kind of working, learning from my, commercial and small business, everything, you've also got to be able to kill stuff fast. We sometimes focus too much on starting a lot of stuff, but then we get these long time cycle projects that we keep doing, and we're afraid to kill it or afraid to move it or change the trajectory on it. And that takes some leadership courage. And it takes some real organizational high levels of thought, because nobody wants to work on something that didn't go anywhere. And so you've got to, again, I talked in the last segment about focus on mission. And then if you can roll back to what's the best thing for the mission, and maybe the best thing for the mission is not to do this thing anymore, to go do something else. And you need to value the person that can do that as much as the person who delivers on something.
Exactly.
And normally the way organizations think through things.
That is exactly one of the fundamental roadblocks for a lot of cultures is that people get measured on delivery, even if nobody uses it at the other end, but I delivered it versus the ability to change directions and the contribution they make wherever they can contribute. We talked a little bit about, the sourcing or the engagement around agility coming from academia, research, other parts of the military, and also small business. The challenge, I can only imagine, would be how do you make your organization friendlier with some of these organizations to engage with the military where they can make a contribution?
Yeah, so I think, one of the things that's really worried me over the years, and one of the reasons I stood up SoftWorks when I was at SOCOM and a couple of these other things is, particularly as the percentage of the population who's got military experience or served in the military is getting smaller and smaller. A lot of folks want to help the military. They just have no idea how. Mm-hmm. And it can be a little bit of there's normally a pretty high level of barrier to entry, some by design from some players, some just by sheer bureaucratic size. And so what I really do is focus on how to reduce the barriers to entry. I work for a small business waiting to come on active duty. And so, I've lived the dream of, billable hours during the day and writing proposals on nights and weekends and put your company, on the line every time you do a major bid if it costs you, a couple $1 million to do a proposal. And so a lot of our focus is really to break down that barrier to entry, because ultimately I'm trying to create the environment where you are incentivized to bring me your best idea as quickly and for the least amount of cost possible, right? And so the way, again, we're kind of approaching that is create those collision spaces which have very low barriers to entry. Mm-hmm. You have an idea, I'm going to have a spot all over the country you can walk in with your idea. I've created a thing called Naval X, which is really just to connect the whole naval network together. So if a sailor has an idea, he can instantly figure out who the right person in the Department of the Navy to talk about it. If a company has an idea, they don't have to hire 5 business development people. We can get them immediately linked in. And quite frankly, we can link multiple small businesses together, because many of the ideas I see from small business are great ideas. They just don't understand I actually have a better application for it than they may have thought of. I think there's also a little bit of a sense the big businesses own kind of DoD procurements. Last year, we did $16 billion of contracts directly to small businesses. Wow. 18% of the Navy's spend went directly to small businesses as a prime contractor, much less as subcontractors. So yes, there are big, aircraft carriers and submarines and big capital programs. We also break those down so that on our big ships, we build it, shipbuilders will build the ships. We separate the combat systems, all the communication systems. Those aren't built by the shipbuilder. They're built by the best in class to build combat systems and communication systems to get out of this. Again, I go back to this diverse and inclusive environment. I want the best performer. I don't care where they come from. Exactly.
And I know, I've, followed you for a little bit, and I know about your work at Thunderdrone and SoftWorks, so the military civilian, idea incubators that you put up in Florida, and the success that they've had. And, it is impressive. And I didn't realize that the Navy did that much procurement from small businesses. And so I think, people naturally will step out of even attempting, just because out of the fear. It's the fear of the unknown of, how do I don't get too close to the octopus, because the octopus will crush you in the process, right? And how do you provide that contribution? So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Continue our conversation with Hondo, Secretary Geurts. When we come back from this commercial break, you're listening to Killer Innovations on the BizTalk Radio Network. Welcome back to Killer Innovations. We're continuing our conversation with Hondo. See, I've gotten used to it now. I have a hard time getting over the that. But hey, we were talking during the commercial break a little bit about other ways that businesses can better engage with and contribute to the challenges that any organization has. In this case, the Navy and the Marine Corps. Is there a place, or what's the mechanism for an innovator to say, "Hey, I see an opportunity to solve a problem that the Navy, Marine Corps has, and how do I engage with that? How do I find out where I might be able to contribute to?"
Yeah, and again, an organization this big, I don't think there's one perfect answer. So I think what I'm trying to do is create as large a surface that's available, that both geographically or bureaucratically or technically, that allows folks to connect. A couple different things we're doing. We spend about $500 million a year in small business innovative research. So we broadcast several times a year. Here are the topics we're really interested in doing, and to give you a sense of those. And with those now, we're putting collaboration events together to say, okay, when I say autonomous ships, here's all the technologies we think we need. Here's where we're looking for folks to come in. We talked a little bit about SoftWorks as kind of a collision space we did at Special Operations Command. We've expanded that. I've kind of taken that mindset now to go at scale in the Navy. And so we're creating what we're calling tech bridges. So these are areas where we've got a nexus. They're not on bases or out in the environment. Think of them as, you would think of them maybe as tech clusters focused around a mission area. So we've announced already 5 of those. One might be in undersea warfare. One might be in simulations. Simulations is in Orlando, as you'd expect. We see that number expanding broadly. And then the other thing we're doing is really looking at the tools. So this year alone, we're 7 times more commercial contracts than traditional DoD contracts. We've doubled the number of.
Does that mean then you're procuring off the shelf then types of technologies?
Yeah, or even if it's not off the shelf, it's with a commercial contracting model, not a traditional DoD, far somewhat bureaucratic model.
Right.
We've doubled the number of cooperative R&D agreements we have with different entities, whether they're companies or academic institutions. We're doing a number of prize challenges, which is, here's my problem, I'm looking for a creative solution. If you can bring the solution, you'll get paid on the spot. And then we're trying to, especially for small businesses that don't have the staff or the finance to carry, waiting 12 months to get a contract, really pressing to shorten the timelines from idea to contract award. So for our small business innovative research, we're looking 90 days from when I say, I'm looking for something like this, to then you being on contract. And then having that contract mechanism allow us to carry you all the way through into production if the technology is successful and meets one of our needs. And so really kind of taking an ecosystem approach, because if I can get all that bureaucratic waste, time to award contracts, red tape to award contracts out, I can do more for the dollars I have. And then back to our agility comment, then I can operate at scale and speed.
Interesting. I mean, as you started this whole conversation off at the beginning about creating surface where people can reach out and touch and have that path in is important. And there's a lot of very creative work that's being done. In fact, I just interviewed Dean Kamen from DECA Research. I interviewed him on stage at an event in New Orleans a couple weeks ago. And I've been up to visit Dean. Dean and I have known each other for a long time, and he's talking about a project he's doing with the U.S. Army on printing donor organs, bones for people in the military who've been injured in combat, and how do you develop innovations and technologies. And that approach was very, very creative. And it sounds like not just the Navy, but the whole defense procurement activity is really trying to turn around. I mean, I don't want to turn around in a negative sense because of the challenge and the scale that you have to operate at, but think differently about how do you engage with people as brilliant and as creative as a Dean Kamen out there.
Yeah, and so I go back to it, right? We're trying to be multidextrous. We've got to be better at just doing one thing. So we've got to be really good at doing big things, big capital programs that take a lot of money, and then we got to be big, good at the smaller stuff, and finding a way to be able to do all those simultaneously. But again, I don't see that I see that as opportunity space. And the last is we have incredibly challenging problems that we have not thought to apply technology to. Mm-hmm. We spend, well over $10 billion a year on ship maintenance. That's a very manual process right now. That is ripe for folks to come in and say, instead of putting an inspector in a tank, we're going to do this in an automated fashion. Mm-hmm. We talked a little bit about how do we train, our force is constantly regenerating itself. How do we use modern technologies to train? We're in the largest capital building of ships that we've done in 30 years. We have a very junior shipbuilding workforce. How do we use modern technology to accelerate the training so I get the equivalent of a 20-year shipbuilder without having to wait 20 years? So part of ours is also opening our mind to putting the problems out there that we don't think of traditionally as technology problems out there for the people like you mentioned to go attack.
Exactly. As we wrap up today's episode, just as kind of I'm going to try to bundle this up into one. You talked about, decentralization. You talked about differentiated performance. You also talked, as we were wrapping up here, develop talent. Hondo, I just want to thank you taking the time out of your busy schedule to join us here today on Killer Innovations. And, congratulations on the great job at Navy and Marine Corps. I can tell you from my interactions at the Marine Corps, you are held in extremely high regard by the people in the units there. So thank you again. Thank you for your service. And we will hopefully catch up with you soon the next time I'm in DC. For those of you listening, check out all the show notes. We will have links to the programs in that to help you get connected and potentially contribute your ideas and innovations to the challenges and the opportunities with Secretary Geurts and the Marine Corps and Navy. And again, thank you very much for joining us today on Killer Innovations. And we will be back here in the show for next week. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.